Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julie Shackelford. I am Texas Director of the Conservation Fund, and we would like to welcome you this afternoon to our panel on conservation real estate fundamentals. Today, we are going to introduce you to the real estate concepts that are used in acquiring land for conservation and walk you through the conservation land acquisition process from beginning to end. And we'll do this in the context of the recently acquired 39-acre Dogwood Trail by the Big Thicket Natural Heritage Trust as a case study. First, let's introduce our panel. First up will be Lily Engel, otherwise known as Elizabeth, who is Deputy General Counsel with the Conservation Fund based in Northern Virginia. Then David Bezanson, who is Associate Director of Land Protection for the Nature Conservancy, will speak. David currently resides in Austin. And lastly, Ellen Buchanan is President of the Big Thicket Natural Heritage Trust, and she lives in Coons. Before our panelists speak and get to the heart of the conversation, I'd like to just explain a few basic concepts for you all. And first, some terminology regarding what we are proposing to buy. Fee simple acquisition means owning the land outright. For example, when a land trust owns a preserve, they may have obtained the property either as a donation from the landowner or they may have purchased it, but either way, they own the property in its entirety. So that's fee simple acquisition. Alternatively, a conservation easement is a permanent restriction on property that is intended to protect conservation values. The landowner, in this case, continues to own the property, but the land trust owns a partial interest in some of the property rights. For example, the right to subdivide the property. Today, we're going to focus on fee simple acquisition, although most of the definitions that we're talking about today will also apply to conservation easements. So acquisitions can be time-consuming and expensive. And I'm going to give you some initial questions to contemplate as land trusts before going down this road to make sure that you are as prepared as you can possibly be for a land acquisition. So the first question is, does your land trust have the organizational capacity to do acquisitions? Do you have the staff capacity? That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have paid staff, but you do have to have a dedicated person who can lead the project and raise the funds and herd the cats, organize all the parties and the pieces that are involved in this multifaceted project. So if you have someone who can do that, that's a great first step. The next thing you need is an attorney, or at least access to an attorney. As you will hear from Lily's presentation, there are a lot of roles for an attorney to play in a land acquisition. So if you can answer yes to those questions, then you can move on toward an acquisition. As a land trust, even before you get into land acquisition, you should consider developing some organizational project selection criteria. And this will help you identify good projects in advance of any acquisition. It's super easy to get excited about potential projects, but it would be tough to do everything that comes through your door. So if you can have a process, and especially a written process, that's going to help guide you to make sure as a land trust you're selecting the best projects. And it can also be really helpful when you're talking to funders to help you be able to articulate what your goals are to those funders. Regarding the project selection criteria, a couple things that you need to think about. Any project needs to fit in your organization's mission. Projects you should decide in advance what kind of conservation values your organization is interested in protecting. That could be a waterway, for example, based around a river. It could be a habitat, for example, you could focus on prairies. It could be threatened and endangered species, or it could be around a project geography. You may encompass all of Texas. You may be operating in select counties. You may be targeting specific land features. You may be looking at landscape corridors, acquisitions that would tie together already protected properties, or it could just be a circle on a map. But it would really help you identify good projects to be able to operate in a specific geography. The other thing to think about is scale. I think that it takes just as much effort to do a 2-acre acquisition as it takes to do a 2,000-acre acquisition. So if you have the funding, you should go big. One thing to think about, though, is Texas property tax code only allows nonprofits to own up to 1,000 acres tax-free per county. So if you're going to be buying more than 1,000 acres per county, you will be paying property taxes. So that's something to think about as you consider your future expenses. Regarding the property, who is going to own it? Are you, as a land trust, going to be taking ownership of that particular piece of property? Or is your role in land acquisition to facilitate the acquisition and then have it move over to either a public entity or another nonprofit charitable organization in the long term? Think about the property's condition. Is it ready to go, or does it need significant restoration? What are the long-term maintenance needs of the property? And have you factored in all of your organization's overhead cost in order to accommodate restoration and maintenance? One of the big questions is fundraising required. And David Zanson is going to address this shortly, but obviously super important. Do you have all the funds in hand? Is it going to take public or private funding, or is it a mix? Do you have enough capital on hand to be able to purchase the land outright? Or if you don't, do you have the ability to secure a loan so that you can purchase the land right up front? Is the landowner willing to wait for you to raise all of the money? This is a big question. Sometimes the timing, your timing and the landowner's timing is just different. The landowner may say, I want to sell this property, but it needs to happen in 3 months. Can you accommodate that? Or is your timing that you need longer to be able to do that? And the other thing you need to get cleared up pretty quickly is value expectations. Does the landowner have a realistic expectation of what the cost per acre is going to be on this property? Or are they asking something crazy? Because you're going to need to be getting an appraisal. And if there's a big difference between what the landowner thinks it's worth and what the appraisal thinks it's worth, then you run a significant risk of the project potentially falling apart. The Land Trust Alliance's standards and practices contain Standard 8, which is Land Trust Project selection criteria. And this can be really helpful to you as a reference guide as you move forward with this process, considering whether you're going to be able to take on land acquisition. To answer some of those specific real estate questions, I'm now going to turn it over to Elizabeth Lily Engel with the Conservation Fund, who is going to be able to answer some of those questions for you. Thanks. Lily?
Hello, everyone. As Julie said, I am going to try to take you through the mechanics of a land transaction today. Clearly, this topic is one that could fill years of study, as it has for me, and I still have a lot to learn. But what I can do today is give you an idea of what it is you need to learn more about and what the areas of danger are, so to speak. I'm going to preface all my remarks by repeating essentially what Julie just said, that the Land Trust Alliance standards and practices are a deep resource for land transactions. Also check out the Accreditation Commission's requirements manual. That's a super helpful resource that if you're going to operate a good and efficient and responsible land trust, you really need to take advantage of those if you can. On to the substance. So once you reach an oral or even a preliminary written agreement with the landowners, you're going to need to proceed to a formal written memorialization of that agreement. There are two basic forms of agreement that you can choose between to purchase land. Those are a contract option or a purchase and sales agreement. An option is literally an exchange of money, an option payment, for an agreement by the seller to keep that property off the market and not sell it to anyone else for a period of time while you decide if you want to buy it. You pay a non-refundable option fee of X dollars, that's completely negotiable, to the landowner. And during a time period, no one else can look at or buy that property until the date on which you need to advise the landowner that you want to buy that property or not. If at the end of this option period, you elect to exercise your option and buy the property, then you and the seller enter into a purchase and sales agreement that sets out in detail the roadmap to your purchase. If you know from day one that you want the land, then you can simply start with that purchase and sales agreement. So a purchase and sales agreement needs to contain certain basics, all of which are open to negotiation. The obvious items are the amount of your earnest money deposit, which is also known as a good faith deposit. That's a portion of the purchase price you pay at the beginning, and it gets held until the closing. The price of the property, or a way to determine it. So if you're going to do price per acre based on a future survey to determine acreage, just say that and spell it out like that. A title company or a law firm who's going to do three things: hold your earnest money deposit, obtain a title commitment or report for you, and three, conduct your closing. Then you need a time period for you to study that property, which is the due diligence or the inspection period, also known sometimes as the feasibility period. A date on which your deposit becomes non-refundable, which is also known as the deposit going hard, and a date for the closing on your purchase. That's the day you give them money and they give them your property. So the purchase and sales agreement also should address what costs the purchaser pays and which the seller pays. These are usually completely negotiable as well. So do a good deal, basically. In addition to the basics, your purchase and sales agreement should be sure to have contingencies, meaning reasons that you can terminate the contract at no cost to you if certain goals are not met or certain items are not obtained. One example of a contingency would be if you receive an appraisal that falls below what you agreed to pay for the property, or if you receive a phase 1 environmental assessment that shows toxic waste dumps on the property. You really need to be able to terminate that contract and receive your deposit back with no further liability to either party. And I'm going to talk about those two things in more detail later on. Another key piece of the contingencies is a funding contingency. And that says if you don't receive your required funding by a certain date, often the closing date, you can terminate and receive your deposit back with no liability to either party. So it's essentially, contingencies are walkaways. So if I don't get X, then I get to leave. As I mentioned earlier, the purchase and sales agreement always should have a due diligence, inspection, feasibility period that provides you with a set period of time, 90 days, 110, 20 days, if there's a lot you think you need to look at, 6 months, to obtain the appraisal, a survey, a title commitment, a phase 1 environmental assessment, a mineral report, and then ideally the approval by your funding sources or your partner in the transaction of all those items. You need to approve them, but it's great to have your partner or your funder to approve them as well during the due diligence period. At the end of the due diligence period, if all those items meet your and your funder's approval, you advise the seller that the due diligence contingencies have been satisfied. And in most cases, at that point, your deposit goes hard, becomes non-refundable, and you can move forward with any last steps toward closing. I'm going to go into a little more detail here on each specific due diligence item. Let's start with the appraisal. As a nonprofit organization, you are prohibited in most circumstances by IRS regulations from paying more than the appraised fair market value of the property to a private landowner. If you do pay more than the appraised fair market value to a private landowner, This could constitute what's called a private benefit under IRS regulations to a landowner that could jeopardize your very nonprofit status. So do not do this. Thus, you will need to obtain your own independent appraisal. If you're dealing with a funding source, such as the state or federal government, those entities usually have their own guidelines and requirements for what needs to be in appraisals, and often for even what appraiser you use. They have lists of approved appraisers. So please be sure to know those requirements before you go ahead and hire someone to do the appraisal for you. If you agree to a purchase price that's anticipated to be and that is confirmed to be, once you have your appraisal, much lower than the appraised fair market value of the property. So you agree you're going to pay $1,000 for this property, and the appraisal comes back and says it's worth $5,000, then the seller might elect to claim the tax benefits of what's called a bargain sale with the IRS. They can get a deduction for essentially giving you a gift of that value. There are very specific and technical steps that both you and the seller need to take in order for this tax benefit to be claimed. So please be sure to consult your tax professional or lawyer or someone who's very familiar with bargain sales to understand this process, because you want to make sure the seller understands and you understand what you both need to do for the seller to take advantage of this tax benefit. Another wrinkle in your appraisal area is if there are marketable assets on the property, such as timber or minerals. Minerals meaning oil, gas, even gravel, coal. If there is timber of material value, meaning this was a property that a forest logging company owned, and there's millions of dollars of trees on the property that they were planning to cut, that's going to have value, and you're probably going to need to obtain a separate timber appraisal, often called a timber cruise, and you might need to take that value into account in your purchase. Minerals are a whole separate and complicated issue that I cannot possibly fully address, but you should know several things about minerals. If someone other than the seller owns the rights to the minerals on that property, you have to be sure you fully understand what that means in terms of the conservation values of the property. So that means if someone owns, Blackacre, but someone else owns all the coal under Blackacre and the right to mine it, you have got to know what that means in terms of the values of the property you're seeking to protect. For example, does the owner of Blackacre coal have the right to do surface mining? Is it a right only to go underground from a neighboring property? So burrowing under. Is the right limited in time? So is there an expiration of that right if Blackacre coal owner does not actually exploit his ability, her ability to dig the coal up, and then all of a sudden they lose it? So you need to know all those rights. You need to know the full scope before proceeding out of your inspection period. So that's going to come up in your title report. You can get a separate mineral report that explains to you who owns every mineral and what that constitutes. Next, on to minerals and bargain sales. If your transaction includes a bargain sale or a conservation easement, you absolutely have to get a mineral report, which tells you who owns the minerals, and then a mineral remoteness report, which is a report by a geologist or someone equivalent that concludes that the possibility of exploitation of those minerals is so remote as to be zero or close to zero. So that report's going to say, yeah, there's coal under there, but it's in seams that cannot possibly be mined. No one's ever going to do it. Or it concludes the opposite, meaning there's a lot of coal under there. You'd be a fool not to dig it out. If it says the latter, you probably have a deal killer in many circumstances. I'm a lawyer, so I cannot speak in absolutes. There's always an exception. But for this purpose, if you have a bargain sale, you cannot have surface mining, and any oil and gas exploration on the property is severely limited. This is very important. The IRS is not going to permit a bargain sale with those rights extant. So please know about your minerals. And in Texas, that's going to probably be an issue. Finally, about appraisals. This is not just minerals, this is your appraisal in general. Be sure as you approach closing, you check to make sure your appraisal is younger than 1 year old. If the appraisal is older than a year, you're going to need to get an updated appraisal or a new appraisal for lots of reasons. Land trust standards and practices is just one of many. So that's appraisals, or at least all I can tell you right now. The next item you address during your due diligence period is the title and survey. Actually, that's 2 items. The next items you address. Rule: if you are buying property, you must have owner's title insurance, please. Owner's title insurance should protect you. It's insurance, so there's always a should. In the event that there's a challenge to or flaw in your ownership of the property after you close, after you take title to that property. An example of that would be that the property had a mortgage on it years ago, and that was paid off, but the release document was never recorded in the land records. So it's still showing in the land records that there's a mortgage, which constitutes a lien against that property. So you want to be protected against that eventuality. In theory, when you ask your title company to issue you a title commitment during due diligence, what you get is a full report, an accounting of the title history of the property. So Joe sold it to Jane, sold it to Bob, sold it to Fred, which then reflects all those ownership interests, but it also shows you easements on the land, unpaid mortgages. Anything that affects that property in the land records should be in your title report. These items are called exceptions in the commitment. They're usually on Schedule B2, but that's in the weeds. Anyway, they're listed in the title report. And these are things that you either decide that you can live with, or you ask the seller and the title company to work to remove them. Things you can live with are probably going to be like power line easements, because there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do about that. That's been given away, it's recorded. It just is something, an exception you can live with. Something like a mortgage lien that was not released, that's not something you should be able to live with, because that means that mortgage company theoretically could come back and buy the property. So be sure also that you have your title report updated as of the date of closing. Because if you get it 6 months before closing, during that time period, that landowner might have had a judgment against them. And judgments can be recorded in the land records, and that would constitute a lien against the property. So be sure to have that title report effective as of the date of closing, updated. So once the exceptions you objected to were addressed prior to or at closing, so that lien was removed, everything's looking good to you, and the deed is recorded, you will be the owner and you will be issued an owner's title policy. In the future, if an item that was not listed as an exception pops up, so all of a sudden in the future, someone comes along and says, I have a judgment lien recorded against that property, but the title company missed it, they didn't tell you about it. In theory, the title company is then required to bear the cost of correcting that issue and giving you clean title under your insurance policy. This is why, even though it almost never happens, you really need to have title insurance. Title commitments always have an exception for matters that would be shown on a survey of the property. You can certainly elect not to obtain a survey and risk exposure to these items. And such items would be, and often are, things like a fence that meanders back and forth across the property because neither the owner nor the neighbor actually got a survey when they built the fence. So that's an example of a survey exception that you might want to know about. And there are 2 general types of survey: an American Land Title Association survey, which is incredibly detailed, and a non-ALTA survey, which provides a little less detail, but it's certainly still valuable to you. Surveys are very expensive. ALTA surveys are even more expensive. Non-ALTA surveys are valuable as they show boundaries and encroachments such as that wandering fence. They sometimes don't suffice for the title company to delete that exception, but that's okay if you're confident about your property and what might appear on it. If you've actually been out there and you see that there's nothing you need to worry about, you probably don't need an ALTA survey. However, if you're dealing with a federal partner, sometimes those entities might require a more detailed survey. Again, this is communication with your partners and your funders ahead of time. The final due diligence item I will discuss is an environmental site assessment of the property. There are three types of environmental site assessments. The one you usually hear about is the phase one. We just refer to it as a phase one, but it's technically a phase one environmental assessment, a phase two, and a phase three. These examinations should be done by a company that's licensed and knows how to do them and writes the appropriate report that contains the appropriate professional standards for these reports, which are actually a thing that's issued. There's a whole book of standards for phase ones and twos and threes. And this report needs to give you specific language, such as this report is based on all appropriate inquiries. It also lists data gaps, things that the contractor couldn't find. They couldn't access, some records about the property, so that you know all about all the issues on the property, and you also protect yourself from future liabilities. A report needs to contain that language to provide you with some protection from future liabilities for environmental things on the property. So that could be, there's something on a property that leaks onto the neighbor's property, they might have a claim against you. That's an example of a liability. The primary difference between a phase one and a phase two lies in the scope of work. So a phase one primarily assesses paper and conversations. It assesses the likelihood that the site is contaminated through visual observations, historical use reviews, like was this ever a gas station, and regulatory records, state records of toxic waste dumps. While a phase two assesses whether contamination is in fact there via testing. So if your phase one interviews found the prior owner said, yeah, I buried some gas tanks on the property, and then the visual inspection by the contractor notices stained soil in that area, you will want a phase two to test that soil for hydrocarbons. If you reach a phase three, that usually means you don't want the property. That's not a good thing. It's seriously contaminated vertically and horizontally, and it needs extensive remediation. So this is why you do this during due diligence when you can walk away. The most common property, just to give you some examples, you're going to encounter on your properties is a leaking underground storage tank, the aforementioned buried gas tank, and cans of paint thinner, pesticides, flea and tick spray, all these things that people just pile in sheds. They're often in outbuildings around the property and they might have leaked. So you need to know that. There are also the ever-present solid waste issues, which are also known as junk piles filled with refrigerators and ever-present. You're going to want to ask the seller to address these issues prior to leaving inspection, and you're going to want to follow up to make sure they've been dealt with so that it's an acceptable condition before your deposit goes hard. So, because of my time limit, I have provided an extremely superficial treatment of the important elements of a land transaction. I've omitted many colorful and amusing anecdotes from my real world. You should have taken from this that there's a lot you should know more about, and you definitely would benefit from a lawyer experienced in real estate before embarking on a purchase. Consult a lawyer before signing the contract. After, not a lot I can do to help you. My contact information is in your material, so while I can't give you the specific advice or counsel, I'm always available to answer questions I can or share helpful examples from my career, funny stories that might give you some guidance. So thank you for your time. We're going to pass you over to David now, who's going to give you some really good information on how to find the funds to buy your property.
Thanks, Lily. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the unique details of this particular transaction, the Dogwood Trail, but also using it as an illustration of transactions in general, like Julie and Lily have been talking about. Beginning with project selection. And as Julie discussed, how projects are selected happens in various ways. Sometimes a property is identified by the land trust using their criteria. Sometimes landowners self-select, they contact us, and their projects either meet the criteria or don't. And either way, the land trust representative often will visit a property years before being able to really figure out how to do the deal in terms of funding. And This transaction was somewhat unusual in that I selected it when I was 10. I grew up in East Texas, which is pretty much the deep South. And my grandmother was a fourth generation East Texan, was a Southern lady and big into gardening and related activities. And she heard about this place called the Dogwood Trail, which was not too far from where we were used to live, and took me on a day trip to see it in her big Cadillac. And I was very impressed with it, even though I was 10. Very memorable property. It was spring. It was beautiful property, spectacular wildflowers, and even at that time, really big timber, which you don't always see in East Texas because a lot of the forest property is in active rotation. And it's true of East Texas and Texas in general that there's not a lot of public access to nature. And this was a public hiking trail, which was maintained at that time by the Texas Forestry Association. They had a program which they called the Forest Trails Program. And later that program sort of disappeared over time as many of those lands, which were private timber land, were divested. A lot of the timber property in East Texas over time has been transferred in ownership from timber companies to other kinds of entities like investment firms, REITs. So this of course had happened to the Dogwood Trail too, but amazingly the trail was still there. The current owner had chosen to maintain it and keep it publicly accessible. It wasn't clear for how long, since it had changed ownership several times. And so that caused me to be concerned as an adult working for the Nature Conservancy at that time about how to protect it and protect those sites. So, which kind of brings me to one of the themes that we need to highlight, that I want to highlight. This business is all about funding, right? Conservation without money is just conversation, right? So fitting available funding to a project is kind of the meat of what we do. And critical to our work is finding new ways to acquire land, new ways to purchase parcels that landowners bring to our attention or that we identify with our criteria. And so kind of the holy grail is finding a new revenue stream that we haven't been able to tap into that will allow us to do an acquisition. And I became aware of a program which is administered by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Recreational Trails Program, which I felt was an untapped or underutilized source of funds for land acquisition. It's transportation money, federal highway money, originally from the ICE-T, and it funds construction of trails, motorized and otherwise, for recreational use, public use, which is great. It's a great program, but typically those trails are on land which has already been acquired. And again, in Texas, that's very limiting because we don't have a lot of public land relative to other states. And so I wondered if the program could also be used to acquire land if it had a trail on it that could then be kept publicly open. And I thought about those East Texas trails, like the Dogwood Trail. So, new money, not a new program, but new money from a land acquisition perspective. The Rec Trails program does have some things in common with other conservation funding. Like a lot of the programs that we use, it's competitive. And so I had to write a proposal, and it included maps and pictures, and submitted it to the committee, which ranks those projects. And they deserve credit for believing in the project and ranking it high, even though it wasn't the kind of project which they were used to, which typically was focused on, like I said, trail construction on land that's already owned by an entity like a county or municipality or the state. Full disclosure, I am a member of that committee, and that's how I knew about the process. But I, of course, recused myself because I had known this project since I was 10. Also, another way that the Rec Trails program is like other programs is that it requires non-federal match. It's federal money, but you have to bring match to the table. And Ellen will talk more about how that went down, but the 20% match was a main issue, big issue in how we we structured the transaction. And another consideration is that the program is a reimbursement program. So to do a land purchase, to do anything with the Rec Trails money, you have to pay up front and get reimbursed. And in this case, because it was a significant outlay, the money had to be borrowed, which the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, we have our own internal revolving fund, so we can do that, but most land trusts don't. And because of the relatively small size of this property, it wasn't feeling like a TNC or CF project. So that's when Ellen stepped up with her trust. And that brings me to the other really big point that I wanted to make with my presentation, which is the collaborative nature of getting a land transaction done. To get a deal done, you not only have to stack funding, but you have to bring in many partners that participate in many different ways. And Ellen will talk more about all of the participation by the partners on this project. But I just want to mention a few aspects which are sometimes neglected. And the first is the seller. One of the most important components of a land acquisition is the seller. The seller has to say yes or no to the deal. And a big challenge that we face is to present the transaction in a way that will enable the seller to say yes and act in their own interest. And this is a pretty good illustration of that, because in this case, as I mentioned, a lot of the timberland in East Texas now is held by entities like REITs and TIMOs, timber investment management organizations. And the seller in this case was a TIMO, Hancock Forest Management, which is John Hancock Insurance. And they manage a large amount of timberland in East Texas, large and fluctuating amount of timberland, which they manage on behalf of their clients, which are investors. And so they have very limited ability to do anything that doesn't act very exclusively in their investors' interest and demonstrably. And so they deserve a lot of credit for even entertaining this sale, and a lot more credit for making the sale smooth. When you manage 1 million acres, which they do, selling 39 acres to a nonprofit is not your highest priority. And but they never treated it like it wasn't, and they worked with us in a lot of different ways on a lot of details. And as Julie mentioned, the little land transactions can take as much work as the big ones. So, that was kind of an opportunity cost, probably from their perspective. They are also not able to take a tax deduction or benefit from it. So, bargain sale, was not on the table here. It had to be a full price offer. And with any transaction, a big part of the success is making that offer and backing it up with an appraisal that is appropriate and complete, as Lily discussed, and also that the seller will accept. And I don't mean by that you pick an appraiser who gives you the number you want. That's not right, obviously. You have to have an appraisal that is supportable by the market, but you want to find an appraiser who will use a methodology that is appropriate for the market, that local market, and the particular property, an appraiser that speaks the language of the seller and delivers a product which makes sense for them. And in this case, of course, the biggest component of that was valuing the timber, because as Lily also discussed, in East Texas, in this part of East Texas anyway, the base land values are not very high, the dirt value, but timber growers are pretty proud of their trees. And in this case, this tract has one of the things about it that made it so remarkable and impressed me so much when I saw it the first time and ever since is the old growth is maybe kind of a debatable term, but I mean, this is a stand of hardwood and pine, which has not been logged in all of the time that we have records for. And it's got some huge trees, and it has a very natural condition and composition and structure. And you don't see that a lot anymore, and certainly not in places that are accessible to the public. And so everybody, all the parties knew that, and the seller knew it too, and they put a high price on the timber. And they weren't necessarily planning to cut it because of the public access component, but they did expect to get paid for it. And so the appraiser that we chose was very experienced with conservation easement appraisals, also had enough experience with timber valuation in East Texas that they were that the appraiser was able to recognize the value of that old growth timber and come up with a price that the seller accepted. So in any transaction, another really important element, just touching on a few, the takeout is all important, the ultimate disposition. And in this case, this transaction is illustrative of that. It's an interesting part of this story. The ultimate recipient of the Dogwood Trail property is going to be the Texas Forest Service. And just as the Rec Trails program was kind of a new program for us and what we do, the Texas Forest Service is somewhat new as a partner in this role. They do hold conservation easements, and Julie and I have worked with them in that capacity quite a bit. And they also own state forests, which are managed forests, and they promote there's a state agency that promotes forestry, but they don't usually maintain trails or properties that aren't in active forest management. So they, are not top of the list in terms of a takeout strategy necessarily, but I pitched it to them by reminding them of the history of the program that I mentioned at Texas Forestry Association, which they work closely with, and that legacy. And I have to say, like everybody who heard about this project, and there were many partners on this project, they were great about it, and that was also smooth. I talked to the director for maybe a minute about this thing, and he was like, yeah, we want to do that. So it will be the first state forest trail, or I don't know what it will be called yet, but we'll get to the details later. But none of this would have been possible if they hadn't agreed to take the property, because there was no other obvious local partner. And then an additional point about partners is even the vendors who do the due diligence steps that Lily discussed, they are important partners in these deals. Even though they get paid in full, the surveyor, the appraiser, they all did quick work for cut rates, and that's also value that the land trust adds, knowing who to call in a particular geography to do an appraisal, to do a survey or a phase one. That's an aspect of what we do that we sometimes take for granted. As Lily mentioned, due diligence can vary a lot in price, surveys in particular. So, that's a neglected component of land acquisition transactions. And now I will turn it over to Ellen, who I have to say deserves probably the most credit of all the partners for saying yes, knowing at least most of what she was getting into. And she'll talk about the funders who gave enthusiastically to this project, as well as, some more about the process of implementation. But I guess in closing, the themes I want to hit are, again, there were lots of partners, and it always takes that, almost always takes that. And the other takeaway is it was a new source of funding, and with any new source of funding, there are new hurdles to jump over. There are new problems that have to be solved by all of the parties, as well as just convincing all the parties that these funds can be used for this purpose. And that's an important lesson, because we spend a lot of time in this business chasing money, funding, and it's always hard to get. But sometimes new possibilities are hiding in plain sight. And in this case, new money was able to allow us to protect a special property, which I had known about for a long time and had not known how to save. So I'll turn it over to Ellen.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to a little bit of Southeast Texas. We appreciate Julie picking the Dogwood Trail. If you're not familiar with East Texas, the Dogwood Trail is located just outside of Woodville, Texas. This is in Tyler County, close to the Neches River. And the Dogwood Trail is on Toodlem Creek. I know you probably can't see the spelling. It doesn't even spell like Toodlem. And then Toodlem Creek runs into Village Creek, and Village Creek to the Neches River. As David said, the Dogwood Trail, we don't know how many years it's been there. It's been there for a very, very long time. I can trace it back, at least 60 years, if not longer. Woodville is a very small town known for dogwood. They're having their Dogwood Festival this weekend, so it's a great activity to go and do. When I was a kid, went to the Dogwood Trail many a times because I had a great aunt that lived there, so very familiar and had been to the Dogwood Trail. When David called, we're a small land trust. We're all volunteers. Mostly what we do is we acquire properties that are adjacent to the Big Thicket National Preserve, and then we donate those properties to the National Park Service for inclusion into the preserve boundary. So this was a little bit different project for us. It was the same thing of acquiring a property and then donating it to the Texas Forest Service. So that fit our mission. We also try to usually acquire properties that are on waterways, and then this was on the waterway because the hydrology would form the Big Thicket and is a very important part of East Texas. And so we're always looking to conserve creeks. So when David called, the first thing to do was, figure out what the project was going to cost, take it to the board, because that was the first step, is for board approval. We had a $250,000 grant from Texas Parks and Wildlife Trails grant. So that meant we had to raise $50,000 of those dollars. And then we knew how much money also that we could get what we needed to price the appraisal at, or we weren't going to price it, but we knew what we were going to have to come up with for the timber company. So after we got board approval, then it's working with David on the application, talking to Texas Parks and Wildlife to make sure that we completely understood what was going to be required of us. I at one time worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife State Parks and state parks had gotten trail grants for parks. So I knew about the trail grants. And then we had to figure out if we were going to, could come up with that match, because that was the biggest thing. At the same time, this was going to be $200,000 of free money. And how can you pass that up? Come to find out, Parks and Wildlife had not done an acquisition in about 10 years. So they were a little rusty on this. So we were all learning at the same time. David helped, had a lot of partners, could not have done this without our partners and especially our funders. Texas Conservation Alliance raised some money for us from foundations. We had individuals give us money, and then other foundations give us money. I will say this too, that one of our donors was Maxine Johnston. Maxine's now 92. Probably 40 years ago, Maxine was leading hikes onto the Dogwood Trail. And so we've known about the Dogwood Trail forever. And again, this was just a piece of property that we had to get, as David said. And what made this a good project is that around Tyler County, besides the Big Thicket National Preserve, there's just not that much public land. On the west side of Woodville is Heritage Village, which has some trails, but besides the preserve, then they don't have that many recreational opportunities. So a great economic, hopefully economic engine for Woodville also. Now, one thing that's always happened is that I've kept up with people. I knew Julie when she worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife, Reggie Hall with the Conservation Fund and their Conservation Loans Program. I knew Reggie from about the time that he came on to the Conservation Fund, because being a small land trust, we don't have the funds for that $200,000 up front, and we were going to have to get a loan. So one of the first things I did was call Reggie, let him know about this project, as he thinks that would meet the Conservation Fund's criteria for a conservation loan? And he said, it probably does. Now, we still had to apply, but we were trying to get our ducks lined up in a row. As David said, Hancock Forestry was fabulous. I mean, when you consider that this is 40 acres that we were going to take out of a several hundred acre property, and they were willing to do this. So we met with the foresters on site, met with them, with the surveyor. I'm going to go through everything that Lily just told you about. So we met on site with the surveyor to talk about where the boundaries would be. And we didn't quite know the exact acreage it was going to be until the surveyors did their thing. Hancock was also very good, and this is something to think about, and we have to in East Texas, acquiring these timber properties is, of course, we wanted public access. This property is on a timber road, so it's not on a public road. And Hancock, again, was very generous and gave us an easement to the property. And then they also gave us, they didn't give us, we bought it, property across the street, across the road, it's a dirt road, for a parking area so that we wouldn't have to cut timber on the property, and we would have a parking area. We couldn't do this, as Lily talked about, we couldn't do the title commitment until we had a survey that gave us our meets and bounds, what abstracts the property was in. But as soon as we got the survey, then we could get our title commitment. And as Lily said, and this was, I didn't know Lily before this, but this was a great deal because met Lily and her staff, and they were fabulous. Again, I call them part of our partners in helping us get through this. At the same time, we were working with Hancock's attorneys, and we have an attorney that we work with. And so with all three attorneys, we did a good job. And Lily and her staff really did a good job on keeping us on the straight and narrow. And that oil and gas, of course, if you're in Texas, then there was oil and gas on the schedule. And we got that fixed, and that's working with our title company, who we work with all the time. This property is a beautiful beech, magnolia, loblolly. There's your loblolly pine there. Again, this property hasn't probably been cut in over 100 years. And so it's just fabulous. And I was just out there the other day, and the understory is full of maples and all. And I mean, it's the beautiful spring. And I'm going to show you another slide here that kind of shows you a reason that we really wanted to acquire this property, and that David talked about. In the foreground, what you see is a clear cut and then a pine plantation. And in the background is the trees of the Dogwood Trail. And so those are trees that probably some of them have been around for over 100 years. And you can see the stark difference between a pine plantation and then that 100-year-old forest. So one of the first things that we did after we got through with the boundary and the appraisal, and as everybody has said, we had to get 2 appraisals on the property, one appraisal for the land and then one appraisal for the timber. And for us in Southeast Texas, the timber appraised for more than the land. And again, when you have trees like this, then that was a lot of saw logs and these loblollies, which we don't want to see go down. One of the things we did to also with our funders is David helped, and we got several, again, foundations and private individuals to donate. And then we had a local foundation whose main purpose is in the arts and in conservation. And I knew this family, and we invited them out to the property for a site visit. And so the whole family came out for the site visit, and we took them on the trail, which is very exciting when you, we've had so many hurricanes. Hurricane Rita to start, which was more of a wind and knocked down trees, and then Hurricane Harvey, which was water. And so the trail does cross Tootlam Creek and some other creeks. and the bridges are really no more. So there, it's kind of an adventure to walk the trail and go on the bridges. But they were game for it, came out, walked the trail with us, and then we got that funding from the foundation, which we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. And in fact, we raised more money than the 250, which we needed, because you have your phase one, your appraisals, your closing cost. And so we were able to raise enough money to close the deal on the project. So without all of our partners, and I will say this, especially with the Conservation Fund loaning us the money, which we knew we could pay back. It's kind of scary, but we knew we could pay it back. We're still waiting on reimbursement from Parks and Wildlife so that we can repay our loan. But what a great project. And they walked us through it the whole way. So everybody pulling together with this project, we couldn't have done it without our partners. So I want to thank everybody for getting this done. And again, Hancock Forestry for being willing to sell the property to us. And Julie, back to you.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to all for your contributions this afternoon. I want to ask anyone, I guess probably Ellen, other than David's initial finding the property when he was 10, once you really got rolling, thinking that you wanted to try to acquire this, what kind of time frame are we looking at in terms of guidance for new land trusts who are potentially interested in acquisition? I mean, how long has this taken you to do?
The project took quite a while, and one of the things is because it was Parks and Wildlife and federal funds, then the Federal Highway Administration had to do a resource study, I guess phase one. It took 2 years. I hate to say that, but it took us 2 years. But what that did is that gave us time. I called Reggie Hall with the Conservation Fund. Here's our project. What do you think? We started lining up funders, to make sure that would go through. So it took us 2 years to get the go ahead from Parks and Wildlife, and they tell you don't do anything until we give you the go ahead. But patience on all land transactions, whether it's this one or others that we do, it's patience in getting this done. Again, we hold a lot of property now that will go to the preserve, and we're waiting on the federal government for that property to go into the boundary of the preserve. So patience to get beautiful property.
Yeah, it speaks to the importance of having a patient seller as well, which we did in this case.
Yeah, and it for us, the Conservation Fund, we acquire many properties and convey them over to the federal government, and it can, if state or federal government is involved, it can. I mean, 1.5 years would be really fast. It can take 2, sometimes even 3 years to do all of the steps that you need to do in order to get it conveyed over to those entities. Ellen or David, what advice, or Lily, what advice do you have for new or land trusts who are maybe interested in getting involved in a land acquisition but are a little nervous? Any thoughts to encourage them on how to get started?
Be nervous. That's good. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. I would say, just from 25 years of doing real estate law, always expect it's going to take probably 2 times longer than you think and cost a multiple more than you're anticipating. So budget for more interest on any loan you're getting, assume things will be difficult, and you'll be fine. If you expect the worst, if the worst doesn't happen, it's pretty good. So
and
that's a general advice.
And as far as managing expectations goes, be sure that when you're working with the seller, that you also manage their expectations, and you have to be able to give them bad news with finesse, because it's always going to take longer than they would want.
And patience is worth a beautiful property and conserving that in perpetuity.
Yep.
Absolutely. What about for folks who are interested in, or I guess nervous about the private funding aspect? You know, people could say, well, I don't know where to even begin to look for private funding, let alone public funding. Any thoughts there on foundations or going to your members, things like that? Is it difficult to raise a private match, or do you find it to be reasonably doable?
Yes, it's difficult. It's like Lily said, don't walk into it without eyes open. But I will say, and obviously relationships are crucial. You can't raise money without having good relationships with the people that you're going to raise the money from. But I will say that a good project is the way to really, to get out there and raise money for. So
great. All right. Well, I think this concludes our session on conservation real estate basics, and I want to thank everybody for attending. We'll take a quick break and make sure to go back to the homepage to join into the virtual roundtables. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our participants, and have a great afternoon.